Welcome to the Robertson and Easterling podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Craig Robertson.
And I'm Matt Easterling. Craig and I are board-certified family law specialists, which means we're basically professional storytellers. Together, we run one of the most successful boutique family law firms in Mississippi.
As divorce attorneys, we are professional problem solvers who work with real people during the most difficult seasons of their lives. And those life stories are what we'll be talking about in each episode.
So now, sit back, relax, take a deep breath. Everything's going to be okay. You found us, and what you're about to hear is going to help. Today's podcast is the first of a two-part series. We're with Dr. Mark Hagwood, who has been both personally and professionally involved in the field of addiction for 30 years now. In part one, we talk a little bit about Mark's childhood, how he grew up, traumas that he has experienced in his life, and how those traumas affected him as he grew up. He is also a divorce survivor and tells us about what it's like blending two families together. I think you'll really enjoy this podcast.
Some of my favorite people in the world work in mental health. I've had this running joke for a long time that some of the most interesting people that you'll run into on any college campus are either in the art department and the psychology department. And I actually took a lot of classes in both the art department and the psychology department. And so our guest today is no exception to that rule. He's interesting. He's really a man's man. His name is Dr. Mark Hagwood. Mark has his own counseling practice, and he's here today to tell us a little bit about his story and how it became the foundation for the work that he does with people every day. So, Mark, thanks for joining us.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me today. I look forward to being able to share my story and, hang out with you guys. I don't get to see y'all very much anymore.
Yeah, it's good to see you. It's been a long time.
Let's jump right in. Mark, tell us your story.
Well, my story, I guess, starts with like most people. My parents got together and got married. They were high school sweethearts, and Dad worked his way through MillSaps and paid for it. And he went to law school at Ole Miss. And so there's this family belief that hard work will get you where you need to be. And so that was sort of an underpinning of growing up in the household that I did. My parents got married and had me when my dad was at, like I said, Ole Miss Law School his last year. And then he got a job in Greenville, Mississippi with a law firm there. And when I was 4, my mother was in a horrific car accident, and she lost both of her legs. They were amputated on the scene. In Greenville in the 1970s did not really have the ability to deal with trauma, so they took her to Memphis, and she was gone for about 6 months. And what I know now looking back is that that's a pretty significant trauma from a developmental standpoint for a young child. For the longest time in my story, like most people, I didn't really see that as a traumatic event. Most of the time growing up when things happen in our childhood or even adolescence, we sort of normalize it. It's just kind of the way life is. And that's what I did with that event. But looking back, I realized that during that time, I began to feel fear of the world, insecurities, and then anger developed the further I got into my elementary school and junior high school.
So that's obviously, I'm glad that you bring that up. I think that we as individuals, we do have these events that happen to us throughout our childhood that really shape our worldview, and we bring those dynamics into our future relationships, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do. And then, so that's like a big T trauma. In the psychological world, you'll hear big T versus little t. And so big T traumas are the big events in our life that, whether it's something like that or whether it's, an Iraq veteran coming back that's watched their buddies get blown up by an IED, or somebody that's a rape victim, that's a big T trauma. But some of the little T traumas that maybe even are as significant or possibly even more significant, create complex trauma, or some of the developmental things that happen in life. So you stack some things like being bullied, and then having a large event at home, or maybe a parent's alcoholism. And so those can create and spin off some more complex things that people don't recognize as trauma. And most of us have some little T traumas, and I don't know, probably a significant portion also have a mix of big T traumas. And it develops characteristics in us that later in life bleed into our relationships. And so we'll pick that up probably in a few minutes.
So, Mark, as that relates to your story, you said it manifested itself in anger.
Yeah, it did. Anger that was probably fundamentally rooted in fear, in insecurity. And so I remember 12 to 15, just this increasing sense of uneasiness. And when I was about 15, I found alcohol, drugs, and girls, and I thought I'd cured the problem inside. I oftentimes say that I found a solution to a problem I didn't know I had. It simply made the chaos go away.
So alcohol and drugs, but you as a 15-year-old, alcohol and drugs felt like a cure to this anger?
Yeah, it was like the first time that I had enough to become intoxicated. It was like I breathed a sense of relief. It was relief to this chaos that I had inside of me.
Yeah, we had an earlier podcast guest talk about his parents' divorce and how kids are resilient. And because of their resiliency, they'll find ways to medicate the pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a human characteristic as well. So from 15 to 20, I used a lot of alcohol and drugs. I didn't really find anything that I wouldn't do because my goal was to continue to medicate this pain that I had unresolved. And of course, like all addictive behaviors, it grows and gets to the point where it's no longer a weekend activity, and it got to the point where it needed to be addressed, and my parents did an intervention. So when I was 20, they put me in the Mississippi Baptist Chemical Dependency Center. Actually, I turned 21 in there, and I was in treatment for the whiskey that I wasn't even legal to buy. So I get out and I get involved with 12-step programs. And from there, life took a different turn. I began to resolve a lot of those internal conflicts. Got an undergrad in psychology, so I was one of those interesting people that you talk about, and worked on my master's in counseling, and eventually went to Mississippi State, where I did all of my coursework for my PhD, and then moved into the field of counseling.
So at the time that your parents intervened, what was your substance abuse like? I mean, how frequency, amounts?
So when my parents intervened, I was drinking every day, smoking marijuana as much as I could, pretty much daily. The weekend before they intervened, I did cocaine, ecstasy, LSD, all in a 24-hour period of time. And the startling thing was it stopped working. 3 a.m. on Friday night, I came to my senses and realized that I wasn't high and I wasn't drunk, and that was a scary feeling because what had been working so well was no longer working.
And you eventually became sober, and you, based on what I assume was your childhood experience and the experiences that you had with chemical dependency, sought more information, and that led to your study of psychology and counseling. Is that?
Yeah. Originally, my major was business, and I did an accounting class, and I thought there's no way I can do this. And so I've been taking some humanities, and psychology interested me, and then it just sort of naturally developed from that.
So you ended up focusing your education in psychology?
Yes, I got a bachelor's in psychology from Mississippi College, and then I went to Mississippi State University, God's country, and got a master's there, and did PhD work there too, all but the dissertation. I worked in the field where I ran an outpatient program for alcohol and drug addicts in Starkville. And then back here in Jackson, I was a clinical director at COPAC, where we dealt with sexual compulsivity, as it was called back then.
Talk a little bit about the difference between when an addict uses a chemical and a process addiction.
Okay. So with chemical addictions, we're taking substances into our bodies that we become emotionally dependent on. We can also become physically dependent on those. So we actually get addicted to the substance, right? One of the debates that has been going on for a while is, can you really be addicted to a process addiction? And by process addictions, we mean gambling, sex, spending, even maybe exercise, some people throw in there. The answer to that question is yes, because the brain creates neurochemicals in response to everyday behaviors. It also produces neurochemicals in response to chemicals that we're ingesting. So you don't have to have a chemical to become dependent on something. So we can become dependent on gambling, which I've heard is referred to the most pure addiction because there's no substance, there's not food, there's nothing coming into our bodies. We can just get addicted to the high created by it and the lows created by losing. It's the chaos and the cycle that we get addicted to. We can get addicted to sex because, well, for a lot of reasons, but one is that there's a connection piece to it. And then there's a whole bunch of neurochemicals that are released from oxytocin to vasopressin to dopamine to adrenaline. And so we become dependent on these processes to fix our emotions because it feels good. It releases these different highs.
So talk about your family. You moved through school, and what's going on with you personally at that point in your life?
So I worked in the field of counseling for a while in different areas. And then I got an opportunity to get into the business world. And so my father and I started opening McAllister's Delis in Louisiana. We did that for 8 or 10 years. And I was married during that time, had 2 awesome kids. The marriage was volatile. I think it was a combination of both sides of that coin. And eventually that led into divorce, which is a very traumatic time for everybody, my kids and myself. And
how old were your kids when you got a divorce?
Okay, so my kids were about 6 and 9 years old when we got divorced.
How long had you been married at that point?
We've been married about 10 years at that point.
How did you meet your former spouse?
I met her through mutual friends here in Jackson. We were both in the recovery community.
And so you were living in Jackson when you got a divorce. You had been married for 10 years. You've got relatively young kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had moved back from Louisiana, and we were actually living in Ridgeland. And so we got divorced, and the economy imploded right around the same time. And we ended up losing the business that we had, and I ended up filing Chapter 7 bankruptcy. So once again, there's this stacking of traumatic events. And it was impactful for my kids and myself.
So at this point, you're still experiencing these different traumas. You're in recovery. Are you still carrying that anger with you that you talked about from earlier in the show?
So there were different parts. I mean, I've been in recovery for, at this point, 31 years in my life. Then it was 20-something. So there were different periods of growth, just like I think everybody that's on a pathway to getting better in life has peaks and valleys. And so I dealt with a lot of the original sort of anger and feelings of insecurity. However, the volatility of the marriage had created different levels of anger and other emotional things. So rolling out of that marriage, I was an emotional wreck.
Talk about your life post-divorce.
So after the divorce, I went through a period of unemployment because the economy was just awful. I had been in the restaurant business, and I was trying to figure out, what was next. And I met my future wife during that period of time. We were going through similar life circumstances, and we had been friends prior to that, and we rekindled a friendship. She was a believer, and at that point, I was not. I had the anti-apologetic, meaning that I was actually pretty well convinced that Christianity was one of the worst things that mankind had ever invented. And my mother and my sister were also devout believers. So I was surrounded by 3 women who were devout believers. My mother is a godly woman, and she had been praying for me for about 30 years. So I think God just finally got tired of hearing her prayers.
Yeah, moms do that.
Yeah, they do. They're pretty awesome. And so I went to my parents' house for my father's birthday, and my sister and my mother did another Christian intervention on me. And my sister ended up giving me a book to read. She begged me to read it, and through a series of, I guess, me being in a vulnerable place and having my heart, my mind open a little bit, I had what I consider to be a Damascus Road experience.
What was the name of the book?
So the name of the book is Letters from a Skeptic, and it's written by Dr. Gregory Boyd, who is a theologian, and his father. And his father was a Roman Catholic who had lost his faith and became an atheist. And so the premise of the book is that Dr. Boyd was worried about his father's salvation to use a Christian term, but they couldn't have conversations about it because atheists aren't real open to having conversation about religion, like my family found out. But what he had done is he had invited his father to write him a series of letters. And then Gregory, the son, would write back a response. And so what I found is when I was reading the book, I connected with the atheist at first, but the convincing thing for me became that the answers to the questions, like why, if there's a good God, then why is there so much evil in the world? That was one of them, were much more about logic than they were about faith. And about 3/4 of the way through that process, something happened inside of me that was powerful.
Is that what you refer to as the Road to Damascus Experience?
Yeah, it was a profound experience where I think that the Holy Spirit, I felt its presence, and it was about 3 months. It was like I had this light living inside of me from the time that I opened my eyes until I went to bed. And had it not been that powerful, I probably would have written it off as a psychotic break brought on by the amount of stress I had in my life.
So at this point, you're not yet a counselor, but had you been in counseling at all in your life?
So yes, I had gone through training. I mean, I had an undergrad, a master's, and had worked on my PhD. I had been the program director for the Mississippi Counseling on compulsive gambling. I had been an inpatient clinical director for sexual compulsivity and had done an outpatient IOP. This was in the mid-90s. And so I had done it. I had moved away from that. And now I had this experience, and God moved me to go to seminary for a little while. I had a lot of internal chaos about that because I was like, there's no way that you actually want me to be a preacher, not with my history. But I got there and I took a course called Christian Counseling. And at that point, I sort of knew where my road was headed. I enrolled at Mississippi College. They had a newly formed doctorate of professional counseling degree. And so I enrolled in that, and I knocked that out in a couple years. And then I started a private practice while I was also the program director and the clinical director for Harbor House Chemical Dependency Services. So I had been in the field and in my own recovery for years.
And that's the Turning Point Counseling Center that you own and operate today. Is
Yes,
that right?
that's correct.
Hey guys, I'm your new friend Cassie. I'm a paralegal and the client care coordinator at Robertson and Easterling. Are things not working out for you at home? I am so sorry. What you need right now is honest feedback and wise counsel about how the legal system works in Mississippi and how it could impact your future. Click on the link on our website or just give me a call. After a meeting with one of our attorneys, you will feel like the weight of the world has been lifted from your shoulders, and you'll have guidance about what you need to do next. When you're ready to talk, just give me a call. I would love to talk to you. The fact that you even spoke to me is totally confidential. Until then, take care and enjoy the second half of our show.
Let's talk about one of the things that you have experienced in your life, and I think a lot of our listeners can relate to, is the blending of families, because you had been married before. At the time of your divorce, you had 2 kids under the age of 10, and then you met and married a woman who also had children, and the two of you, with all those people, decided you were going to make a life together. So talk about personally your blended family, and then professionally how you guide others who have blended families.
Blending families on the front end, everybody just thinks it's going to be idyllic. It's just going to be awesome. We love each other. And so all the love that we have as parents for one another is just going to somehow bleed into the family.
Right. We Generation Xers grew up on the Brady Bunch. So obviously it was idyllic and perfect. And we had AstroTurf yards, right?
Right.
That's right. I guess what we didn't have Alice, you know. So Alice was the glue that held that family together.
Okay. That's very true.
It was a bigger challenge, I think, in some ways than what we thought it was going to be. So I had 2 biological kids, and I got 2 bonus kids in the process. So Catherine had 2 children. So blended, I have a son who is now, will be 21 at the end of this month. I have a bonus daughter who will be 20 in July. I have a biological daughter who is 18 and graduates from high school this year, and a bonus son who is 16 and is just picked up the driving deal. So,
oh, dude, that's horrifying. I'm going through that myself. And, they should still make those center console brake things because, at least I would have some sense of control. But when I'm driving with my almost 16-year-old as well, all I have is my calming voice and say, maybe we should move over from the side of the road just a little bit. And, maybe we should slow down just a little bit. So, yeah, I feel you, man.
I'm going through, this is the fourth one, so it gets better.
Oh, well, that's good to hear because I've got one more to go. So your kids, your biological kids and your bonus children, as you lovingly refer them to, their ages, I don't even know.
Overlapped.
Yeah.
So with the time that you and Catherine, that's your wife's name?
That's correct.
At the time you and Catherine got married, were your children living primarily with you or primarily with their mother?
So my custody agreement, it's essentially a 50-50 split on time. So they were spending a lot of time in both places.
So you don't necessarily have to share the name of the lawyer, but what was your experience like through the legal system? I think our listeners are contemplating whether or not they want to embark on the journey of talking to a lawyer and moving through the legal system. What was your experience like? And it's okay for you to say, I hate lawyers, everything about them, because the good news is I deal with them more than you do. So,
I don't know. I was raised by one.
Well, I stand corrected. You were raised by one, but people are like, "Oh, lawyers are so mean. Lawyers are so bad." And I was like, "Man, I deal with them every day, all day long, every day." So, yeah, you're right. They are sometimes. But talk a little bit about, for our listeners, what your divorce process was like.
Well, it wasn't smooth, but I don't know of too many divorces that are. I had retained an attorney, and my ex-wife had retained an attorney, which is sort of normal standard fare, but there was not a lot of movement. And it wasn't because the attorneys were wrangling, but she just was not ready to go through the process, I don't think.
And I think we often find that, Matt and I do, that, two people are not always at the same place with regard to the grieving process, and two people aren't always in an emotional healthy place when they make the decision or the decision is forced on them to get a divorce. And you've also told me that you fell into the circumstances where the marriage wasn't great, but the legal system as it is today, even when marriages are often irretrievably broken, there still is difficulty making it through the legalities of the process.
Yeah.
Well, and so for those listening that don't know, Mississippi is a very unique state when it comes to divorce, in that if you live in any other state in the union besides Mississippi, and I want to say South Dakota, you can get a divorce on a no-fault basis. So you can unilaterally get a divorce just because you want one. In Mississippi, that's not the case. You either have to have legally recognized grounds, or the two of you have to agree. So it creates a bit of a trap for people who maybe are not happy in their marriage or who want to move on, but don't have judicially or legally recognized reasons to do so.
It can be a trap, and it can be rather expensive trap too, quite
Absolutely.
frankly.
No question.
Because when people fight over things like just how to get out of a marriage, how to get a good custody agreement, not even over assets. When you have to find cause or you have to find fault, it can get real expensive to prove these things that are in the statutes in Mississippi.
Absolutely. And that's what we try to tell our clients, and we try to keep in mind is, we have a small boutique practice and we represent people. We don't represent big companies. And so we have to be mindful when we're helping someone that nobody plans for the expense associated with a divorce. And to the extent that we as practitioners can streamline that process for everyday people, I think we're doing more of a service to our clients.
I know in my practice when I'm working with clients that it looks like they're not going to be able to resolve their marital differences, whatever the cause. But sometimes the way that the laws are set up in Mississippi, they're trapped. Particularly if you're married to somebody that has like narcissistic personality disorder or some of these other disorders that are longstanding that don't really lend themselves very well to that person being overly concerned with the process. You can get trapped in an abusive situation that you really can't get out of.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Mark, because that's one of the things that I definitely want to talk to you about is narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar depression, because I think there's a lot of confusion around those. But before we dive into that, let's talk about blending families. Let's talk about your blended family and how you counsel those you help as it relates to their new family dynamic.
One of the common traps in blending a family is that unless there's a lot of intentional discussion on the front end, most families just get together and think, well, we'll just kind of figure this thing out as it happens. And many times you often have two parents that have different parenting styles that have been parenting their children for years. And they just assume that their parenting style is going to be the way that they're going to parent with this new spouse who has their own set of parenting approaches. And that one element alone can cause a lot of discord in the family and a lot of discord in the relationships.
Not to mention the complexities associated with the former spouse and their differing parenting styles, if you will. I tell people that, yes, 50% of marriages fail, but there's a higher percentage of second and third marriages that fail. Most first marriages actually work out, but second and third marriages are more difficult because there are more people involved.
That's right. It gets increasingly complex when you start blending families. And so you have your family dynamics coming in, the trauma that your divorce has caused for you and your children. Then you have somebody else, if they have children, coming into it with those same dynamics. Or if you marry somebody that doesn't have children, then you have this weird power differential of you've got one or two or three, like father and kids, and a wife that's coming in with no children. Suddenly you've got this dynamic in the relationship where the father and children or the mother and children, whoever has the biological kids coming in, has more weighted power because there's more of them. The relationships have been longer. And a lot of times there's a lot of resistance about bringing somebody into that from the kids.
So when you're blending these families, if you looked at like a traditional family unit, so you've got a mom, dad, and you got two kids and a dog, you are dealing with the dynamics of basically three other people that are immediately attached to you. But when you blend these families, you are potentially expounding that to, as many as 10 or 12, depending on how big the families are, which is immeasurably more difficult to manage. I've been doing this for a decade and I still don't know how people do that. What challenges did you guys face in blending your families together?
So when we blended our family, we had a lot of the same challenges that everybody else probably faces. My relationships with the bonus kids, right? And then Catherine's relationship with my children. That's one element. And early on, I approached my bonus daughter and said, the nature of our relationship is wholly dependent upon you. My relationship with you is going to be whatever it is that you want it to be. And for her, I think that was empowering because it gave her a sense of control over it. Like I wasn't going to suddenly become disciplinarian dad and all up in her business. I was going to be what she wanted me to be. And I think for her, that was super important. One of the parenting traps I think that everybody has to negotiate when they're blending families is, how is discipline going to work in the house, right? And so I talk to a lot of people that, particularly the men in the family, they can take a role of, hey, I'm the man here. I'm going to be the disciplinarian. I'm not talking about necessarily corporal punishment, just these are my rules and this is the way things are going to be. And that is absolutely dangerous when you're talking about blending families. The rule that I talk about with people is the biological parent is the one that disciplines the biological children, because that's where the relationship is. Now, mom and dad get together, and these are the house rules, right? And so if I have a problem with my bonus kids and I go to Catherine and say, hey, look, these are some of the things that I see are going on, and then she goes and she executes it. with her kids. Now, I'm not saying like she goes off in their room and talks to them. Like, we can all be sitting there, but she's the one that delivers it. And I do the same with mine. Now, particularly in the beginning part, that's super important. As we've been together now for years and years, it's not the same, but you've got to earn that authority position within the family. You can't demand it.
Right. And it sounds like what you're saying is the more empowered the bonus child feels, the better the dynamic and the better the relationship will be.
I believe so, yeah.
You know, Mark, I'm really encouraged to hear you talking about these blended families, because even in my own life, some of my dearest friends who I have the most respect for have parented kids to whom they have no biological connection. I can think of the faces of many of my friends are coming to my mind right now, and whether that's a child that was born outside of their marriage, or whether or not that's a child that their spouse brought into the marriage. It's just a beautiful thing when a person devotes themselves to a child that they don't have to. You know, we do a lot of divorce work, of course, but one of the things that we get to be involved in as family law practitioners is adoption. And so it's not exactly the same thing when families blend together, but the concept is the same, is that we are parenting, mentoring, coaching, shepherding a child to whom we have no biological connection.
You make a choice to love, right? So when you have a child, that natural connection is there because, you know, half the DNA is yours. You help, you know, bring them into this world. You raise them, you nurture them and all that. When you get the opportunity to love a child that you haven't had those early life experiences with, you're making an active choice. In a lot of ways, that carries its own special level of connection.
So, I mean, if what I'm hearing you say is right, anytime we love somebody, it's a choice. If a biological connection maybe makes it easier to make that choice. But when we don't have a biological connection, it can make it special in its own way, because everybody is aware of the fact that, well, I don't have to love this person, or they didn't have to love me. They really chose to love me, as opposed to, well, I have to, that's my child, or he has to, he's my dad.
Right. And sometimes we see, you know, and I've talked about this before on our podcast, we see a reflection of ourselves and our children. And the child also, you know, I am made up of my mom and my dad. And so when someone without that reflection chooses to love, it's just very beautiful. That's what God does for us.
Yeah, it's a powerful experience when you realize that this person's actively choosing to be nurturing, loving, and caring.
Well, Mark, we're going to have you back because I want to talk to you in detail. You mentioned the words narcissism and borderline, and I want to have you back and talk about those things. But how, if people want to connect with you, is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Well, you can look up Turning Point Counseling in Flowood or Ridgeland, Mississippi. Go to our website, and all of our contact information is there.
And what's the URL for that website?
turningpointms.com.
Mark, thank you for being here today, and we can't wait to have you back.
Thanks, guys.
You've been listening to the Robertson and Easterling podcast. Thanks for spending time with us.
We'd love to hear from you if you need our help. You can request a consultation from our website in less than 5 minutes. If you liked our show, please subscribe to our podcast so you'll be one of the first to know when our next episode drops.
Have a great rest of your day, and remember, there's nothing wrong with arming yourself with information. On behalf of Matt and our entire team, thanks for listening. This podcast is not a substitute for an attorney. All information is provided as a general reference and public service. Listening to this podcast does not create a professional relationship with Robertson and Easterling or any of its attorneys or guests. This podcast may be considered advertising under applicable rules, and therefore free background information is available upon request. For a full disclaimer, please visit our website, www.robertson.ms.